Welcome to Innovation and Leadership. I'm Jess Larson. Today on the show, we've got Geoff Cook.
We don't and have never acquired for like picking up a quarter's worth of revenue or EBITDA or DAU, what have you. Because maybe I don't necessarily, I never saw it in the term you're talking about, but I can see how it's aligned because, in order to wrap live video into something, we essentially need to spend.
CEO of the Meet Group. Geoff, thanks for making time.
Thank you for having me.
So for everyone who doesn't know about you guys, give us the elevator pitch.
Sure. So the Meet Group is a collection of mobile meeting apps for meeting new people. And what we do is we try to create the best place to meet new people through video. It's a pretty ripe space to add live streaming video into kind of social chat communities. And that's what we've been doing. We have 15 million plus monthly users, 4+ million daily active users.
And can you talk a little bit about, there's a lot of people with great ideas, but you guys have actually built this thing big enough that now you're a public company, and what that process was like?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a really interesting, I think, process to build. I mean, this all started out literally in, my bedroom now 13, 14 years ago. And has gone through, 2 rounds of venture capital in 2006 and 2008, a merger with a public company, which is why we're public today. And then I started the kind of flagship app, Meet Me, in our portfolio, originally as my yearbook, and co-founded that with my brother and sister, who are still with the company in some form. And then in the last few years, we started adding and acquiring other companies, and we've spent about $200 million over the last 3 years buying 4 different apps: Tagged, an African American community; Lavu, a European dating community; most recently Growler, a gay dating app; as well as Scout, kind of an international chat app. So,
can you talk about that? Because I feel like, just in my own experience, our listeners, a lot of them know about my time, mergers and acquisitions with Citigroup back in the day. And now where, there's so many startups that maybe get trained or get a psychology difference of grow instead of buy. It's not always as common to see a combo strategy these days, it seems like, especially in the tech space. I guess eventually it definitely gets there. But can you talk about just your approach of why you've gone both directions rather than just focus on the one?
Yeah, sure. So I think what we noticed was that, and because we were competing with these apps, we noticed that there was a class of app that had reached significant scale, like 20 to 50 million in revenue, 200,000 to 1.5 million daily active users. But they weren't going to grow to 10x that, right? And that was clear enough. They'd been at it, 6 to 10 years. The entrepreneur, the leadership team of these apps, and they were basically saying, well, look, we're kind of growing at modest percent. There's no exit, kind of for the reason you give. That tends to be a difficult place to exit, and we saw that we actually could add value to these apps by wrapping our live streaming video solution into each of them, and that each of these apps individually would have had a hard time doing the same by themselves, because live streaming video is a fairly sizable commitment in engineering time, moderation capabilities, talent team building out. And so what we essentially were able to do was take these stable traffic platforms, wrap in a live streaming video solution, and turn on, as of February, 82 million annualized revenue business from scratch. Just by activating it on these the app that I built and with the team here, and then the apps that we acquired.
Well, I want to talk about this because, obviously the market is rewarding you. Did I see the market cap this morning is like 400 million? Does that sound about right?
That sounds about right.
And so, there's a lot of folks in the market that agree with the value here. And, when you look at the statistics out there, I think KPMG has a report saying that 82% or 79% of acquisitions end up being worth less to the market cap than what the acquirer paid for them. And, Warren Buffett is constantly talking about how CEOs, and I think about, myself as a former CEO of a private equity fund, how we crave excitement. And so rather than just like sit and get compound interest off of our investments, sometimes we get tempted to go do a deal, and how often like activity gets confused with progress, right? But you have, obviously, so often in an acquisition, what happens is they buy a company for how good the company is, and then they kind of dissolve that company and say, well, just come be part of us. And they take away a lot of the great things, and they mess up the culture, and and then all of a sudden the business isn't making as much as the company they bought because they changed it, right? In your case, it sounds like you guys really did have the discipline to not just acquire for acquisition's sake or for vanity metrics' sake, but because of that video integration of using the massively overused word of synergy. But like, it sounds like you literally did have hey, we're probably worth more together than we are apart.
Yeah, no, I think to your point, there's always this concern that if you're acquiring some other company, that it's not really aligned with your strategy, that you're telling yourself some fiction in order to just attain higher scale, but that you're not really creating value. And we've certainly not pursued certain companies because we felt like that would be the case. We've kind of identified just a very specific sort of company that we feel like we add value to, and it really comes down to, can we video enable it? And the type of company that we can video enable tends to look similar in a lot of respects. Like they tend to have a lot of DAU, be growing modestly but not a rocket ship. A lot of chats being happening among the community. And so we did have this very core strategy that we've just been pursuing kind of singularly. And at the same time, we've been active. I mean, we did 4 deals now in 3 years. We will go a year or more without doing a deal. We didn't acquire anything in 2018. We acquired 2 companies in 2017. So part of this is discipline. We're also looking at the EBITDA profile of the companies, the profitability essentially profile of these companies that we're acquiring. The most recent one we acquired, Growler, was at a 4.5 times 2019 EBITDA multiple, which is, we feel like a good price to pay. We're certainly trading at a much higher EBITDA multiple than that.
Yeah. Can you talk about this? Thinking about if there are other CEOs listening to this, I definitely know that I feel that like bigger is better type of I don't know, mentality, and like I almost have like a craving for growth and for expansion. Can you talk about just any tricks or any just decision making criteria that you would use on yourself to like, how would you keep yourself in check of like, one that's on the corner, like one that's on the edge of, yeah, I can make the case that we can do the video enabled, but I'm not, it's questionable. It's questionable whether it's worth the price, or it's questionable whether it's really as good a fit as you wanted, but man, it'll sure add to the numbers. Can you talk about on those ones that are not clear cut one direction or the other, how you would help yourself?
Yeah. I think when in doubt, leave it out. So, from a portfolio perspective, if you're asking those questions and it's kind of in doubt, I think I myself have been convinced we should acquire something for the PR and IR value for a few days, and then came to my senses. And this
is what I want to talk about, is the coming to your senses. Because like, I agree. I like your, I like that it rhymes. If in doubt, leave it out. But then there's the emotional of like, yeah, but what if I want to?
Yeah. I mean, I think, I think it having acquired now 4 of these things, I think the emotional piece isn't as high. Like the emotional, I must have it sort of response isn't very high in me. I know how much work it is on the other side of the acquisition. And if it doesn't make a great deal of sense, it's still going to be a lot of work. In fact, it's probably going to be a lot more work. And so I tend not to be emotionally involved in these decisions anymore. I would say that wasn't the case in the first one we did, which was Scout. But as we do more of them, it really just comes down to what's the business case, what is the product case. I come from a product perspective on just about everything I do. Why are we creating any value for the users of the platform we're buying? And if we could tell that story, and that's what it will excite me. But from an emotional attachment standpoint, I have a pretty easy time saying no and moving away from a deal if it's $1 more than we want to buy it for.
I'm going to put words in your mouth, so go ahead and correct me. But what I feel like part of the magic of what you're talking about there is thinking of the long term, thinking of the whole process, thinking. It seems like humans make decisions they're a lot happier with the more long term they think about them. Is that fair, or how would you say it different?
Yeah, I think that probably is fair. We don't and have never acquired for like picking up a quarter's worth of revenue or EBITDA or DAU, what have you. Because maybe I don't necessarily, I never saw it in the term you're talking about, but I can see how it's aligned because in order to wrap live video into something, we essentially need to spend probably at least in all the cases in the past, 3 or 4 months of groundwork, just understanding the company we just acquired, and then another 3 to 6 months of actual live video integration work into that company. And so, you're talking about a year before you, typically 9 to 12 months before you're able to do what it was that you wanted to do, which is bring live video to the users of that platform. And so that does encourage, I think, some longer term thinking because, and certainly we've looked at some apps that were like, well, is that app going to be around in a year and a half? This is a kind of DAU trend we're seeing. And, so if it can't pass that kind of core test, like, is the traffic pretty stable? Do we think it's going to be around a year from now in roughly the same levels so that we can capture the value that we see? And that does encourage a little bit longer term thinking, I guess.
Yeah. I think maybe before we move off this topic, one more question for me is I would love to give you your thoughts. I think that the way the business media talks about mergers or acquisitions, they celebrate it like, the announcement of the deal getting done is the end of the story. Like the hard part, we've actually paid for it. That was the hard part. But in my experience, like, on the consulting side of Mylan, we teach these master classes about, helping leaders do better one-on-ones with their staff using like FBI hostage negotiator techniques and stuff. Okay. And one of our big clients, 3 years ago when they brought us in, they had just merged with essentially their arch enemy of the last 25 years. And, half of them was not public. And all of a sudden, so, half the company is instantly $1 billion public company partnered with essentially their arch enemy, and the announcement of the transaction was definitely not the end of that road, right? Can you talk about just maybe one or two of the most important lessons or advice you'd have for other folks of getting two cultures to start working like their one high performance team?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question, and it's one that we're always thinking about, and I wouldn't feel like we have the be all end all answer to, because it does differ on the type of business that you're acquiring. So it's very target specific. So acquisition was very small. Growler, while it has 200,000 plus users, there's only 2 people there. So you're not really talking about cultural issues, because the intention is to actually add 6 or 7 people on top of that team, and that essentially becomes the culture. So that's kind of a relatively easy one. But in other cases, we acquired, in the case of Tagged, 100 plus person company in San Francisco. In the case of Lavu, 100 plus person company in Dresden, Germany. And
so what does that make your staff total? What are your numbers approximately these days?
Right now we're about 250 people, a little north of that.
Yeah.
I think when you're coming into a culture, you kind of have to decide are these going to come into, are the teams and the flow going to come into your process, or are you going to try to keep it fairly distinct? And you make these on a kind of case by case basis based on like the facts on the ground. So in the case of Lavu, when you're talking about literally a world away, in Europe and Dresden, serving languages we don't even support for the most part, it made sense to us to keep that process and team kind of as intact as possible. In the case of other acquisitions, some of the benefit of the acquisition may well be that you can integrate the teams that you're acquiring into your flow. And so, in those cases, it's not easy. Like those are the harder cases to do. It creates, a lot of, I think probably the thing that's useful is to just be authentic, to communicate what you're going to do, and then do it. And while that's easy to say, like be authentic and try to be honest, it doesn't always appear that you are, because the facts on the ground can change. So you might say something and then a business takes a turn in one direction or another, and then 2 quarters later you're saying something else, right? And so like that's just the reality. Like and I think that the way that you deal with that is you continue to be authentic and honest, and you admit like these facts on the ground that are changing. But if the team is kind of understanding where decisions are coming from and the context for them, I think it at least makes it easier. There's no doubt nothing helps more than growth, right? So if you add video and suddenly you turned on a 10, 15, $20 million revenue stream that's now the biggest growing is total absolute dollar segment of revenue for a given app, people I think appreciate that and say, wow, gee, clearly we're recognizing the value of this. But if you stumble out of the gate, that's when things get that's when things get dicey.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about this, and maybe it's a good chance to talk about a little bit more of your background. I mean, besides being Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year and starting your own, starting a company from your own dorm room and selling it for millions of dollars at 24, selling your second company for $100 million. Now you've got this publicly traded business. You obviously have spent some time learning the skill of new customer acquisition, because that's part of those stories, I'm guessing. Can you talk a bit about this?
Yeah, I mean, my view is that these companies go through different cycles. So like there's a different period in a company's life. So like in the very beginning, like when you're probably talking about like where you're kind of just scrappy and trying to find new users however you can, that is probably the most exciting part of a company's life. It's when you're living and breathing the product every single day. You're as deep in the weeds as you can be, and also the most fraught, right? So like the chances are you're not going to succeed. I've certainly built apps that didn't go anywhere, and so I would say that in the each of the apps that I've built tend to be consumer focused apps. And you tend to just need to find that way of breaking through. So, for example, in the case of my yearbook, which became Meet Me, one of the key things we did very early was essentially get lucky and find an app, it was actually a website at the time. And to set the stage a little bit, this is when MySpace was enormous. Facebook was, in one college, and everyone would share their various things like their quiz results or their music interests on MySpace. And we saw, and they would pimp out their MySpace profile with various images and styles. And we saw that trend. I saw that trend, happening, and looked into trying to acquire the apps or the websites that would power kind of those MySpace things, and ended up acquiring a quiz site very, very cheaply, very, very cheaply. that was just well positioned, and kind of grew virally via on the back of MySpace. And then I put a a registration form between, and by quiz, I mean like, what Seinfeld character are you? Almost like a BuzzFeed style quiz, like what vampire are you? What have you? Put a registration form between the quiz and the quiz result, and suddenly, boom! This mousetrap we had built for social community of meeting people that wasn't all that interesting based on the metrics we were looking at. When you drop 10,000 plus people a day into it, suddenly behaves the way you hoped it would in terms of retention rates, and we essentially turned this quiz traffic that was extremely high unique, a lot of uniques, but only a couple pages per unique, like 2, the quiz and the quiz result. We turned that into about 300 pages per unique. By getting them to join the social community and then engage in it. So it turned out in that case, like, the mousetrap we had built was pretty good, but it needed to get off the ground, and I didn't have any money at that time to really catapult it into kind of the orbit by just spending money. Nor would I do that today. And so that was kind of a scrappy, lucky way, essentially, to get it out there. In the case of the editing business I built, that was more of a side job turned into a multi-hundred person kind of editing shop, and kind of grew out just SEO and some smart stuff we did with SEO, as well as with content, putting our content on other apps or websites, and having those. I would say that, like, some other project that I'm associated with now is a app called Podcoin, and it's right now we're mostly focused on the live streaming. I would say 9.9% focused on the live streaming end of things, but the audio end of things kind of interests us too. And this app called Podcoin is basically a podcast player that pays you to listen. And I tend to think that if you're trying to break through in this extraordinarily crowded landscape, that the only chance you have is novelty. Right now, I focus on novelty in more or less all the products we're working on. I do feel like the live streaming stuff we're building is novel. Like it's not on Tinder, it's not on Bumble, it's not. Yeah. It's novel. Paying people to listen to podcasts is novel. If you're at it without a novel idea, it's hard.
Yeah, so I actually really love this idea. We're about up for time for part 1 of the interview. I think this is what we'll start off part 2. Everybody, please tune back into part 2. Jeff and I are going to be diving into novelty and the business advantage of being unexpected. And Jeff, where's the best place for people who want to try out the apps or want to find out more?
You could get any of our apps, but Meet Me, just go to the App Store or Play Store and go download Meet Me in the US is probably a good one to try out. Or if you want to try out a podcast player, go get Podcoin. It's on the App Store and Play Store.
I love it. Okay, everybody, tune back in for part 2.
Well, that's it for the episode. One other thing I wanted to tell you about, if you remember the guys from Convoy in episodes back, Ken Free and Trent Mano, I went on one of their CEO trips to New York, and I met a guy named Brent Thompson, very successful entrepreneur. He was former CEO of Jive Communications, big company now, I think $300 or $400 million. Anyways, he started a new company called blipbillboards.com. I'm super stoked they're a sponsor now. But I remember a year and some ago when I met him, I thought it was genius. Instead of having to buy 6 months or a year's worth of billboard for thousands of dollars, you can buy 8 seconds at a time for like 10 or 20 cents. You pick what billboard you want it on, what time of day you want it to run. And it just puts so much power in the hands of marketers and CEOs who want to try something and see if it works. You can buy as many or as few as you want, change it as many times as you want. I think now our podcast is being advertised on billboards in like 18 different states because we have these guys as sponsors. We're pretty excited about it. Hope you check out blipbillboards.com. Thanks.